Hi everyone, my name is Sarah and welcome back to Everyday Consent. Today I'm going to talk about the body's stress response and how it can relate to silence and consent in sexual contexts. I'd like to start by issuing a trigger warning for content related to sexual assault. Really, by definition, almost anything that I discuss on this channel could potentially be triggering to a survivor, but part of what I will talk about today is an experience that can be very common in instances of sexual assault. So if you're not up to the task of dealing with that at this very moment, please take care of yourself and watch something else right now. Quick aside, a lot of this channel can be easily triggering. It's possible I should be more careful about that. I've tried to be careful, but I'm open to feedback. If you have any thoughts on the subject that you're willing to share, please let me know in the comments or by email. Thanks everyone. So, cool. With that out of the way, let's talk about stress. Stress, and our body's response to stress, can make communicating about consent difficult or even impossible. What stressors affect us and how that stress manifests can vary widely, but it's very useful for us to understand how it might affect our or our partner's ability to say yes or no in sexual situations. Let's back up a little bit. What is stress? What are stressors? What is their relationship? There's a good discussion of this in the book Come As You Are by Dr. Emily Nagoski. I'll put a link in the description if you want to check it out. As Nagoski puts it, your stressors are things that activate the stress response. Bills, family, work, fretting about your sex life, all of that. Your stress is in your brain and body in response to stressors. It's an evolutionary adaptive mechanism that allows you to respond to perceived threats. This mechanism, frequently referred to as fight or flight, evolved back when the threats we were regularly exposed to were things like saber-toothed tigers that were big and scary and could chase and kill us. These days, most of us are rarely exposed to large carnivorous beasts, but our bodies don't know that. Our physiological and psychological response to modern-day stressors like deadlines or traffic is physically the same thing as back when we were being chased down by actual beasties. Now, what is that physiological response? As I mentioned before, it's frequently referred to as fight or flight, but that doesn't tell the whole story. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but basically our sympathetic nervous system is being activated, which in turn activates a whole bunch of physical responses. Increased heart rate, heavy breathing, dilated pupils, pumping adrenaline, and all kinds of other stuff. But all of that has the basic goal of helping you to respond to a threat. If you want to learn more about our body's response to stressors, I highly recommend doing a bit of research or watching a video like this one. There are some parts of this response that are pretty consistent between people, but not everybody reacts to stress in the same way. Sometimes your body will tell you to flee, sometimes your body will tell you to fight, and sometimes your body will freeze. This is a surprisingly common response despite being left out of the name. If you've ever heard of an animal playing dead when confronted with a predator, that's what we're talking about. And it's this freezing response that I want to talk about today. These responses, fight, flight, and freeze, helped us survive when the stressors were things like tigers and wolves, but remember that the sympathetic nervous system is activated no matter what the threat itself is, and that these days, those threats can be anything that we consider a normal part of modern life, like a sick child or an angry boss. But for a lot of these modern-day stressors, our physiological responses don't actually help the problem. You can't fight a sick child, and running away or freezing when your boss comes looking for you probably won't help either. In fact, all of these responses can even make the problem worse, which will itself become a new stressor and make your response more extreme, creating just a feedback loop of awfulness. There are ways to help deal with this and break out of that feedback loop, but for now I just want us to acknowledge that this happens and is part of the human experience. Now, what does this have to do with consent? Let's pause for a moment and I'll tell you a story from my own life. I have a friend who I've had a sexual relationship with for many years. We live in different parts of the country, and so the sexual part of our relationship has always been very casual, and based purely on whether we're in the same place at the same time. But I've known him for a very long time and consider him a very good friend. I like him, I trust him, and when possible, I sleep with him. We had had this kind of relationship for about 3 or 4 years, when one summer he came to stay with me for a week. We were cuddling in bed one night, and it was clear that we were moving towards sex. But something was different. I didn't want to have sex with him. This was a completely foreign concept to me, within the context of our relationship, and even within the context of me as a person. This had never really happened to me before. This was the first time that I had wanted to say no to sex. I was confused, I was upset, and I was scared by what my body was telling me. And on top of that, I was afraid to tell him, because I didn't want to hurt his feelings. I was worried about myself, and I was worried about him. All of these stressors compounded in my head so much that my stress response activated and I froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't explain what the problem was. I couldn't even say no. Freezing like this freaked me out even more, and made the response even worse. Thankfully, he quickly noticed how still I was, and asked me to tell him what was going on. He sat with me for a few minutes, soothing and encouraging me to speak, while I tried my best to do so. Because we had such a close friendship, I trusted him deeply, and that, combined with his supportive demeanor, meant that I was able to slowly start speaking and telling him what was going on, that I didn't want to sleep with him. He responded with kindness and understanding, and we talked things out from there on. Now, what happened in that story? A change in my desire frightened and confused me, thereby acting as a stressor. My body reacted to that stressor, and to the added stressors of my concern for his feelings, by freezing, leaving me unable to speak, and thereby explain to my partner what the problem was. I was very lucky that my relationship with my partner, and my partner's attentiveness to my bodily cues, meant that we were able to pass through this response and calm me down enough to talk things out. This particular story is a specific event that happened to me, but it is representative of experiences anybody could have. Not everyone will be rendered unable to speak when reacting to sexual stressors, but this does happen to many people. And almost anyone could find communication becomes more difficult when reacting to stressors. An extreme, but sadly very common example of this is in cases of sexual assault. Many survivors of sexual assault have reported that during the incident they physically froze. And of course, so very unlike my story from earlier, these survivors were not in a supportive environment, so rather than being able to break out of this state, their circumstances only increased the stressors, and thereby increased the stress response, leaving them stuck in this feedback loop and unable to help themselves. In many cases, this response increases the feelings of confusion, guilt, and shame that sexual assault survivors often experience. They might not understand why they froze, and they may blame themselves for not trying to run away or fight back. Even if fighting wouldn't have helped them anyway, they may blame themselves for not at least trying. Especially if a cop, school administrator, or even a friend starts asking them, well, why did you just lie there? Of course, no survivor of sexual assault is to blame for their assailant's actions, regardless of their physiological response to the event. But that can be a very hard thing to process when dealing with such trauma. This stress response can also make communication more difficult in less extreme, more everyday cases, like when I had trouble communicating with my partner. If my partner had not been so attentive to my bodily signals, that situation could have become much worse, and even turned into an inadvertent sexual assault. And this is why I'm talking about this with regards to consent. Because in my example, and in many similar situations, some stressors may be activating one or more partners' stress responses, causing their bodies to respond in a way that may make it difficult to communicate. So, in other words, a person's body can, outside of their control, make them unable to say the word no, even if they want to and have every intention of doing so. Which to me is a pretty clear example of the idea that the absence of a no is not the same as a yes. Which is why this channel exists, and probably why you're watching. We're all trying to get a better handle on what is consensual, and how to figure out when something is consensual or not. So today was a bit of a heavier topic, but now we know of at least one thing to look out for. We'll talk about this more later, but for now your assignment is to think about some situations where you are stressed, and whether and how this affected your ability to communicate about that stress. Think about what someone around you could have noticed about your behavior to indicate that this was happening. List some things that another person could have done to help you in this situation. Feel free to discuss your responses or anything else in this video down in the comments or privately with me in email. Thanks everyone, happy consenting, and I will see you next week. Look. Because I'm like, it's just, I don't know. Okay, fine. Or I keep imagining fighting a child. It's terrible.